I went to the police station to report a crime, but they ended up handing me a pre-typed confession. In the cold interrogation room of the police station, I, Marie, a victim, recounted the entire truth of the horrific attack I had just endured. But Detective Miller, an older, cynical man, did not look at me like a victim. In his eyes, I was just a troubled young woman fabricating a story for attention. After hours of exhausting questioning about my past, and even absurd details like, "Why did you take a shower?" they presented me with a pre-typed statement, and I signed the lie that I had made it all up, just for this nightmare to end. However, in another city, two female detectives with an ironclad faith in justice, the empathetic Karen Duvall and the hardened Grace Rasmussen, were listening to a chillingly similar story. They did not dismiss the strange details. Instead, they pieced them together, realizing that a serial predator was lurking in the shadows. And the story I was forced to bury that day was now about to become the only key to dragging him into the light. I had not locked the door. It was a careless habit in an apartment building I had always considered safe. I was in the kitchen, getting a glass of water, and when I turned around, he was there, right at the entrance to the living room. He wore a black ski mask that covered almost his entire face. I could only see his eyes, a very pale blue, and the skin around them. He did not say anything. He just held up a knife. He used my own shoelaces, pulled from the Converse sneakers I was wearing, to tie my hands tightly. After it was over, I do not know how long he was in my apartment. I just lay there, on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling. I heard him rummaging through the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator door opening and then closing. Finally, the sound of the front door slamming shut. And then, silence. I did not move. I just lay there. I did not know what to do next. A long time later, there was a frantic knocking on the door. "Hey, is everything all right in there?" A man's voice called from outside. It was my neighbor from the apartment across the hall. He must have heard the noise. I did not answer. I could not make my mouth form any sounds. The knocking stopped, but then I heard voices outside. Soon after, two uniformed police officers walked in. They saw me lying on the floor. One of them knelt beside me. "Miss, are you hurt?" "What happened?" They called an ambulance. That is why I was at the hospital. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling cast a cold, white glow, making the paper hospital gown they gave me look even paler. Every time I moved, it rustled in an unfamiliar way. A nurse entered the room. She did not say much, just went about her work. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm, the machine beeped and then squeezed. Then, she shone a small penlight into each of my eyes. The light made me squint, but I did not turn away. I let her do everything they needed to do. I did not cry. I just sat silently on the edge of the bed, feeling the cool sheet beneath me. I knew what they expected. Tears. Maybe screaming. But inside me, there was nothing. Just a terrifying emptiness. It was as if I had floated out of my body and was standing in the corner of the room, looking down at a girl sitting on a hospital bed. I felt my hands being squeezed. I saw the light shining in my eyes, but those sensations were not mine. My body was here, but my mind was not. When she was finished, the nurse wrote something on a clipboard. "We need to draw some blood for tests," she said, still not looking at me. Then she paused for a moment, as if remembering a required procedure. "Do you want to call someone?" I stared at the opposite wall, at a small crack near the floor. I just shook my head. After the hospital, a police car took me to the station. I sat in the back seat, looking out the window, but not really seeing anything. They led me into a small, windowless room. There was only a metal table and 3 hard plastic chairs. The air in here was even colder than at the hospital. A young police officer, who looked only a few years older than me, sat across from me. He opened a new notebook, placed his pen on it. "Just take your time," he said, his voice trying to be reassuring. "Tell me everything you remember." And so I told him. I described everything mechanically, as if I were reading a report, rather than recounting something that had just happened to me. The man in the black ski mask. His eyes were pale blue. the worn pattern on his jeans, and the way he used my own shoelaces to tie my hands. I spoke clearly, without stumbling over a single word, my voice steady and unchanging. I saw him stop writing. He looked up at me. His eyes no longer held the same sympathy as before. There was a hint of hesitation, of scrutiny. He asked, his voice slightly faltering, "Are you sure he used your shoelaces? That detail is a bit strange." I nodded. "I am sure." I tried to cling to the details. They were the only real things in this mess. But I saw his look. My focus was misinterpreted as detachment. The clarity of my account was seen as a sign of a well-rehearsed story. The young officer did not ask many more questions. A little while later, my foster mother arrived to pick me up. She hugged me tightly in the lobby of the police station. On the way home, she did not say anything, just held my hand. The next morning, as we were eating breakfast, the doorbell rang. It was 2 police officers, but not the young one from the day before. The one in the lead was an older, tired-looking man. He introduced himself as Detective Miller. He did not look at me, but at my foster mother. "We need to ask the young lady a few more questions," he said. My foster mother invited them in. She told me to sit on the sofa, then she sat right beside me, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. Detective Miller did not sit. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around. "Can you tell me a little about Marie?" he asked my foster mother. "What is her personality like?" "She is a good kid," my foster mother answered immediately, her hand tightening on my shoulder. "Quiet, but a good kid." Miller nodded slowly, as if he did not really believe her. He turned to me. "Marie, could you go to your room for a minute? We need to speak with your foster mother privately." I looked at my foster mother. She nodded for me to go. I stood up and went to my room. The door did not click shut. It was left slightly ajar. I stood right behind it, holding my breath and listening. I heard Miller's voice. Lower now. "Are you sure? Have there been any problems lately? Any unusual behavior?" There was a pause. Then I heard my foster mother's voice, also a whisper. "Well, she has had a difficult past. She was in a few foster homes before she came here. She is a complicated kid. Sometimes she does things for attention." I stood there, behind the door. Every word she said reached me. Complicated kid. Does things for attention. Those were not words of comfort. They were accusations. The person who was supposed to protect me had just given them a reason not to believe me. She had just helped them build the first wall. The next day, they asked me to return to the police station. This time, they did not take me to the small room from before. They led me to a real interrogation room, like in the movies. There was a large mirror on one wall. Detective Miller was already sitting there, along with another, younger man. On the table between them was a file folder. I sat in the chair opposite them. No one spoke for a moment. Miller just looked at me, then he opened the file. "We spoke with your foster mother," Miller began. "And we also reviewed your initial statement. A few things do not add up. He did not ask about the attacker. He only asked about me. It says here, you took a shower right after the incident," Miller said, his eyes fixed on the page. "Why would you do that? Who does that?" "I felt dirty," I answered, my voice a whisper. He did not write that down. The younger colleague, who had not said a word until then, spoke up. "Yesterday, you told the first officer that the suspect was about 6 feet tall. But today, your foster mother said you told her he seemed shorter. So which is it, Marie?" My mind went blank. The details began to blur, to overlap. I did not know what to say. Miller looked directly at me. "Do you have a boyfriend? Named David, is that right? Have you two had a fight recently?" "That is not relevant," I said, my voice starting to tremble. "Is it not?" he asked, his tone challenging. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the table. "Or were you with David? Things went a little too far, and now you regret it." I fell silent. They were no longer searching for the truth. They were telling me a different story, one they had written themselves. They were painting a picture of me, a troubled young woman who sought attention, who might be lying to get back at her boyfriend. And the terrifying thing was, as they kept repeating that story with such cold certainty, That false picture began to seem more plausible than my own painful truth. They kept me there for hours. The same room, the same metal table, the same repeated questions. Miller's colleague would leave, then return. The light from the fluorescent bulb started to hurt my eyes. My mind was empty. The details of the attack began to fade, replaced by their accusations, their faces. Then, late at night, when I could barely keep my eyes open, Miller changed. He motioned for his colleague to step out. It was just him and me. He no longer sat opposite me, but pulled a chair closer, sitting beside me, like a father talking to his daughter. His voice was no longer harsh, but strangely soft. "Marie," he began, his voice low and seemingly sincere, "we just want to help you. We do not want to see a young woman like you ruin her future. Filing a false report is a very serious crime. You could go to jail." He paused, letting those words sink in. Jail. Another place where no one would believe me. "But there is another way," he continued. "If you admit you were mistaken, maybe it was a bad dream that felt very real, or maybe you were angry and you exaggerated. If you just admit that, we can drop the whole thing. It will all be over, right now. You can go home and get some sleep." I looked at him, at the man who had spent the entire day tearing my story to shreds, turning me into a liar. Now he was offering a way out, but it was a way out built from the very lie he had created. They were not offering me a way out. They were giving me two hells to choose from, one where I had to fight alone to defend a truth no one believed, and one where I just had to lie and all this torture would stop. I chose to stop. I lifted my head and looked directly at Detective Miller. I said nothing, just gave a single nod. A slight nod, but it carried the weight of everything I had lost. The tension in his face eased. "You did the right thing, Marie," he said, his voice relieved. His colleague stood up and left the room. A few minutes later, he returned with a piece of paper in his hand and placed it on the table, directly in front of me. It was a pre-typed statement. I read it. Every line was written clearly, coherently. It said that I, Marie, admitted to fabricating the story of the attack after an argument with my boyfriend. It said I deeply regretted wasting the time and resources of the police department. Each word was like acid eating away at my soul. Miller pushed a blue plastic pen across the table. It stopped right next to my right hand. I picked it up. My hand was shaking. In that moment, I did not just confess to a lie. I killed a part of myself. The part that had believed in justice. The part that had believed the truth would always be protected. I signed my name. They let me go. It was over, just as Miller had promised. But it was not really over. That lie did not set me free. It became my shadow, following me everywhere. My story, or rather their story about me, was published in a local newspaper. It was just a small article, but it was enough. A few weeks later, an old school friend saw me in the frozen food aisle of the supermarket. She looked at me, then quickly turned her head and pushed her cart down another aisle. My landlord, an older man, knocked on my door one morning. He handed me an old newspaper. "I do not want any trouble," he said, and gave me a month to move out. I tried to find a new job. During one interview, the manager seemed very pleased with my resume. But at the end, he said, "I did a search for your name online." He did not need to say anything more. The nightmares began. Sometimes I dreamt of his blue eyes. Sometimes I dreamt of Miller's face. But the worst was when I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, and I myself would wonder if I had actually made it all up. They had repeated the lie so many times that it began to drown out the truth in my own mind. I had become the story they wrote for me. While I was struggling with my life, I had no idea that somewhere else, something had begun to change. I would not learn until years later that, in a city hundreds of miles away, there was a detective named Karen Duval. She was sitting in an interrogation room, but the atmosphere was completely different. She was speaking with a new victim, a young woman. That young woman had also been tied up, blindfolded, and photographed. Her story also had strange details, things that sounded implausible. But Karen did not doubt. She did not interrupt. She just listened and carefully noted every detail. Then she looked directly at the young woman and said the words I had once longed to hear. I believe you. Tell me everything you remember, no matter how absurd it seems. I later learned that Karen had a teenage daughter. Perhaps because of that, she saw something in young victims that Detective Miller could not. And, at the same time, in another county, there was another detective named Grace Rasmussen. She was a tough, seasoned woman who had handled countless cases. Grace was also investigating an attack with a similar method. At first, she thought it was an isolated case, a criminal operating within her jurisdiction. She did not yet know that her case and Karen's case were just two pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that, somewhere, also contained my piece. Those two cases, in two different counties, might have remained separate files forever. But then Karen did something out of habit. She entered the details of her case into a shared, statewide database, a system designed to find similar patterns of crime. And the system returned a match. Grace Rasmussen's case. I was told their first phone call was brief and professional, but it led to a meeting. They met in Grace's office late one night. They cleared a large table and spread out a map, beginning to pin up crime scene photos and notes on evidence. They compared the details, the small things that most people would overlook. My victim said he had a small scar on his left hand, Karen said, pointing to a line in her notes. Grace paused. She looked at Karen, then back at her own file. Wait a minute, she said. My victim said the same thing. That was the moment they realized the cases were not just similar. They were the work of the same serial predator. While I was struggling to pay rent, while I was trying to forget everything, far away, two women were diligently piecing together the fragments from my nightmare and the nightmares of others. The investigation now changed completely. Karen and Grace began working together, combining the resources of both counties. They went back to the beginning, reviewing every detail, re-interviewing all the victims. Under Karen's patient questioning, one victim remembered something she had forgotten in her initial panic. She had caught a glimpse of a faded tattoo on the attacker's arm when he moved. It looked like an anchor. It was a crucial clue. Another clue came from Grace's case file. A neighbor had reported seeing a nondescript white van parked near the scene on the night of the crime. At the time, the detail had seemed insignificant, but when combined with the other cases, they realized the white van had been mentioned at another location as well. An anchor tattoo and a white van. It was not much, but it was a start. They began the long, arduous process of sifting through thousands of records of individuals with prior offenses, searching for anyone connected to that tattoo or who owned such a vehicle. After weeks of screening files and surveillance, they finally found a name. A man with a minor criminal record who owned a white van and had a faded anchor tattoo on his arm. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, police swarmed a normal-looking house in a quiet suburb. They arrested the suspect while he was still asleep in his bed. He was not a monster lurking in the shadows. He was an ordinary-looking man, a friendly neighbor everyone greeted each day. The decisive evidence was on his computer. They found a horrific collection of photos. An encrypted folder contained images of dozens of victims, including some who had never reported to the police. And then, the truth knocked on my door, not with a loud bang, but with the ring of an old telephone. I was in my shabby rented apartment, eating instant noodles for dinner alone. The phone rang. It was an unknown number. When I answered, there was a short silence on the other end. Then a familiar voice spoke. A voice I had tried to forget for years. Marie. It is me, Miller. His voice no longer had the confidence or harshness I remembered. It was trembling. I said nothing. I just stood there, listening. We got him, he continued, his voice halting. His name is Mark O'Leary. He confessed to everything. And Marie. He stopped, taking a deep breath. We found your picture on his computer. I am truly sorry. I was still holding my fork. My entire world stood still. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just set the fork down on the table. For the first time in years, I felt the shadow that had always followed me disappear. Not because I was happy, but because finally, I no longer had to carry its weight alone. A few weeks after that call, Karen Duvall called me. She asked if I would like to meet her and Grace, We met at a small coffee shop, a quiet place tucked away in an alley. They were already there, sitting at a table near the window. When I arrived, they both stood up. We sat there for almost an hour. They did not ask me a single question about the case. They did not ask me to recount anything. We talked about normal things: the weather, my job, the evening class Grace was taking. Before we left, Karen looked at me. There was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. "We are so sorry for what you went through," she said. "Not just with him, but with us, with the system." That was all I needed to hear. I nodded. There were no cameras, no lawyers, no pre-typed statements. Just 3 women, and a truth that was finally shared. The compensation check from the city arrived a few months later in a long white envelope. It was a large sum of money, an official acknowledgement that they had been wrong. I did not spend it right away. I put it in a drawer and left it there. This morning, I stood in front of a new building. It is the community college downtown. I just registered for a class. I am holding the enrollment paper in my hand, not the check. I look at the glass doors in front of me, watching other students walk in and out. I am looking forward. They tried to erase my story, and for a long time, I let them. But the truth has a strange vitality. It can be buried, twisted, but it never truly dies. My story was not about a lie. It was about a truth that had to wait a very long time to be heard.